Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're going to dive into how the global trade arguments we see splashing across the news right now, stuff like tariffs, protectionism, expanding unions, well, they were actually in full swing over 6 decades ago. We often think of our modern interconnected global economy as this recent invention, right? Like it's a byproduct of the internet age. But the truth is, the seeds for the intense economic debates we're having today were planted way, way before most of us were even born. To really see exactly how these seeds were planted, we went digging. We pulled actual archival records from Cambridge University Press and JSTOR to examine this incredibly fascinating, pivotal time capsule. We are genuinely unearthing a buried treasure of economic data here. The detailed, behind-closed-doors notes from the 12th session of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, better known as GATT, which went down in late 1957.
So we're taking this massive multi-week conference and breaking it down into 5 key themes: the 1957 trade world, the rise of the Eurobloc, developing nations sounding alarms, waivers and trade drama, and finally, expanding the global map.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the 1957 trade world, focusing on that global trade momentum. Picture this. It's Geneva, October to November of 1957, and the delegates are driven by rapid-fire deadlines. The clock was literally ticking. They were under immense pressure because major economic milestones were looming right on the horizon at the turn of the new year. A brand new 3-year period where tariff concessions basically couldn't be withdrawn was set to lock into place on January 1st. That meant nations had to scramble to get their trade terms straight before the door slammed shut for the next 36 months. And on top of that, the 6 European countries of the coal and steel community were fast approaching the end of their transitional period on February 10th. So the pressure was absolutely sky high to get their global house in order before these massive shifts took effect. Moving right along to Section 2, Rise of the Eurobloc and the Shifting Landscape. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because we get to see the foundational blueprints of what we now know as the modern European Union. The delegates were highly focused on the Treaty of Rome, which established the brand new European Economic Community, or the EEC. Just imagine the shockwaves this caused back then. GATT suddenly had to figure out how this massive new unified bloc would disrupt long-standing existing trade agreements. They had to ask, how does this new European powerhouse overlap with our own interrelated global obligations? It was totally unprecedented. Because this was such a monumental shift, GATT actually had to form specialized subgroups just to study how this new Eurobloc would impact the rest of the world. They broke the whole puzzle down into 4 main areas: global tariffs, quantitative restrictions, which, by the way, are basically strict legal limits on exactly how much of a specific good can be imported or exported, trade in agricultural products, and finally, the highly complex association of overseas territories with the community. It was this massive, delicate undertaking to make sure this brand new bloc didn't just completely shatter the existing global trade balance. All right, on to Section 3, Developing Nations and Systemic Inequalities. So the crucial point is captured right here in this dynamic. During these ministerial meetings, alarm bells were absolutely ringing. There was deep, vocal concern that less industrialized countries were losing serious ground compared to their highly industrialized peers. You see, the less industrialized nations were heavily harmed by even the tiniest drops in the prices of primary products. Think your foundational raw materials and basic crops, like cotton, rubber, or coffee. And compounding the whole issue was widespread agricultural protectionism by the wealthier nations. So developing nations were essentially forced to sell cheap raw materials while being effectively locked out of wealthy markets when they tried to maintain a strong export trade position of their own. To objectively tackle this growing divide, the GATT Executive Secretary was instructed to appoint an independent, non-governmental expert panel. Their job? To analyze these medium-term trade trends without taking any political sides. They wanted pure, unfiltered data on the systemic economic issues, strictly avoiding judgments on any individual country's policies. Now, as you can imagine, in the theater of global politics, that is much easier said than done. They were basically trying to mathematically solve a highly emotional, highly political global divide. Which brings us to Section 4, Waivers and Trade Drama. We're talking retaliations and quotas. And this brilliantly illustrates the specific, and sometimes incredibly petty, trade retaliations between nations. 60,000 tons. That is the exact maximum limit of wheat flour the Netherlands was authorized to cap from the United States. Why such a super specific number? Well, it was a direct, formal complaint and an equivalent retaliation against the U.S. for restricting imports of agricultural products under its Agricultural Adjustment Act. It's basically a perfect example of mid-century tit-for-tat. When one country throws up a regulatory wall, the other throws up a quota of exactly 60,000 tons.
We also saw other major players jockeying for position all across the globe. Delegates openly criticized West Germany, claiming their proposed import liberalization program was totally insufficient to meet their GATT obligations, especially considering their booming post-war economy. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, India had to actually intensify some restrictions due to massive foreign exchange drains, but they crucially managed to reduce discrimination between their import sources. And in a rare win for free trade, nations like the UK, Australia, and New Zealand proudly announced they had successfully reduced their previous trade restrictions. Everyone was vigorously navigating their own unique economic hurdles on the world stage.
And the sheer variety of micro-disputes on the table was staggering. If you ever think modern trade wars get overly specific, wait until you hear this list. We had formal international complaints about Brazilian internal tax discrimination, the French stamp tax, and yes, even Greek duties on long-playing phonograph records. There were arguments over French and Italian agricultural machinery, and they even dedicated time and serious diplomatic energy to arguing over United States duties on spring clothespins. It just goes to show that nations will fiercely defend their domestic industries, no matter how remarkably small or specific the product is.
Finally, Section 5, expanding the global map, growing and changing. Let's look at how this builds the global community we know today. There was actually a specific three-step automatic loophole for newly independent nations to join GATT. First, you had to be a dependent territory where GATT already applied. Second, you achieve autonomy in your trade matters. And third, you get sponsored by your former metropolitan territory. This exact process was a huge deal because old global empires were actively dissolving right at this time. It rapidly accelerated globalization, allowing newly independent nations like Ghana and Malaya to quickly become the 36th and 37th official members of GATT, right there at the 12th session.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Major expansion hurdles remained for others, particularly for Japan. Despite being a post-war economic powerhouse with massive export capabilities, Japan's trade relations were practically stalled out. Why? Because a staggering 15 different nations outright refused to apply GATT obligations toward them. Trust was heavily fragmented in 1957, and this massive geopolitical roadblock was causing severe friction in Asian and global markets. Ultimately, the 12th session ended with an agreement that this massive exclusionary roadblock would simply have to be punted to the agenda for the 13th session. The world was connecting, sure, but international cooperation was still heavily fractured. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen how the roots of our modern, interconnected world, the European blocs, the developing world's struggles for fairness, the hyper-specific retaliatory tariffs on everyday goods like clothespins, they were all firmly planted at this conference back in 1957. So I'll leave you with this final thought. If the international trade debates of 1957 look almost exactly like the debates of today, what on earth will they be arguing about in 2057? Thanks for joining this explainer and keep learning.